And there you have it, the U.S. President Joe Biden speaking from the Oval Office this evening, addressing the American people about his decision to bow out of the 2024 race. Now, there was some speculation that perhaps he might give his reasoning as to why he decided to leave the race on Sunday, despite weeks of saying that he was going to stay in it, that he was going to fight Donald Trump and be reelected to the presidency. But of course, that all changed this past weekend. And I think there was some hope, or at least some speculation amongst Americans, that they might get a better understanding as to why Joe Biden decided to withdraw. That did not really come out in what was essentially an 11, 12-minute speech from the Oval Office. Instead, we heard Joe Biden talking about the road ahead, that it is not about him, but about this country, in many ways addressing what it had to have been a very difficult decision for him to walk away from his chance at a second term and perhaps doing more as the U.S. president. He also talked about how the United States was essentially, or is essentially, at this inflection point and at a moment when Americans must decide who they are, a moment when Americans must decide whether or not character still matters. Mr. Biden also went on to discuss what he still hopes to accomplish, essentially addressing things like seeking a cure for cancel, U.S. Supreme Court reform. We know since the essentially the rolling back of Roe v. Wade, that has been very much in conversation amongst Democrats, and he also talked about NATO strengthening alliances. So much that he still hopes to accomplish, because, and this is an important point, while he is passing on the torch to Kamala Harris to essentially become the Democratic nominee, that still must be confirmed at the party convention in August, he still, Joe Biden, is going to finish out his first term, which means essentially another 6 months in the White House. So to talk about this and what we heard tonight, we are now joined in Aspen, Colorado by Bruce Heyman. From 2014 to 2017, he served as the U.S. Ambassador to Canada. And in Val-de-Mont, Quebec, Robert Russo, Canadian correspondent for The Economist, former Ottawa bureau chief for both the CBC and the Canadian Press, and also someone who worked in D.C. covering both the presidency of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. So Rob, I think you're our first guest up right now. Well, there you are, Ambassador Heyman. Thank you to the two of you for joining us this evening.
Hello.
So listen, and I'll begin with you, Ambassador. I'm wondering, when you listened to Joe Biden, what stood out for you in what he had to share with the American people?
So for me, it was a pretty emotional moment. You know, I as he was talking, I was reflecting on all the various times we were together. He swore me in. We traveled together. We traveled several times in Canada, to Vancouver, the Women's World Cup, to Ottawa for the state dinner that the Trudeau government had in his honor after Donald Trump had won in 2016. And I thought about all that he had done and dedicated to the country as a senator, as a vice president, and so much as what he was able to accomplish over these last 3.5 years, and what it must have taken to come to the point that he came to. And I was one of several who thought it was time and expressed myself in that way. But it took his own decision to do this, a selfless country first, over party and over self. And for me, it was an emotional time. I was also thinking about when I was in the Oval Office and the meeting with then Prime Minister Trudeau and President Obama, and I literally had the seat right next to the Resolute desk and my arm up on that desk. And so, gosh, there's a lot that's going on here in America, and people doubt sometimes whether we have our act together in democracy, and yet the wheels are turning in an effective way, I think.
Mm-hmm. So an emotional moment for you, as you say. You know, Rob, I'll ask you to answer the same question. What stood out for you as you were listening to Joe Biden this evening?
Well, it's hard not to be struck by some of the historic nature of what we heard tonight. This is a preternatural political being who has spent more than 50 years in Washington, arrived there as a very young senator at age 29, has sought the presidency more than once, has been forced to withdraw from a race once, was told in effect to stand back, even though a lot of people thought as vice president, he should have been the one to go up against Trump in 2016. He certainly felt that way, but was told by President Obama and others, no, you've got to make way for somebody else, in this case, Hillary Clinton. So this is a man who, for decades, wanted this job. And though it's being described as a selfless act, in effect, he's been driven from the office. He's had to come to realize that he can't, although he defeated Trump in 2020, he cannot defeat Trumpism. He doesn't have the horsepower to do that. And he has to allow somebody else to take the job that he's been after for decades. So it's hard not to be struck by that. It's hard not to realize that the historic import of the moment that we've just seen only once before. It's been 60 years since a president willingly left after his first term. So this is really extraordinary, and it is, as Ambassador Heyman said, emotional as well.
Mm-hmm. Emotional, and I appreciate that it was a difficult decision for President Biden, Ambassador Heyman. But I do wonder, because we've passed many weeks now since that first debate on CNN, when President Biden just seemed to be struggling to find answers and to find oftentimes a point of what he was saying in response to Donald Trump. Did he take too long to come to this conclusion?
It's hard to say whether it was too long or not long enough. We got ourselves to a point where, he had to do what he had to do. Look, when you walk up to a star athlete who's had a wonderful career and, has the championship in his or her past, and then you say your time's up, it's just hard to give it up, whether you're a business leader, community leader, athlete, or politician in this case. And I think we're lucky that he didn't wait much longer. I think it gave the space and time for the things to happen that happened over just these last few days. And it's pretty amazing, actually, what's happened. I'm sure we'll talk about it. But I don't think he took too long, given how long he's been in office and the office that he held, and he won all the primaries and he had all the delegates. If he wanted to jam this through and have a fight with the party, he could. But I think there was a realization that would be pretty darn ugly, and there would be no winners in that result.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Heyman, Robert mentioned the word legacy, and I think that very much is on people's minds right now. Is it fair to say that Joe Biden saved his own legacy by deciding to step down?
No doubt. No doubt in my mind he saved his own legacy. He saved the legacy of the Democratic Party, too, because had he not stepped down, my fear, which was the fear of many in the Democratic Party, is that we wouldn't just lose even the battleground states. We would lose some number of additional states that the Democrats hadn't lost in a long time. And then down ballot, it would be affecting state and local races. It would be potentially a profound set of damages done to the Democratic Party. And so I think that was averted. And I think he saved the party. He saved his own legacy, indeed.
Mm-hmm. Rob, a thought on that?
Well, we'll find out in November. Certainly, I think he came to realize that the public had seen what it saw on June 27th during the debate and was never going to be able to unsee that. Whether or not that was an accurate reflection of President Biden's physical and cognitive ability, an impression had been made, and that impression was likely indelible. I think there will be lots of questions, and I think Vice President Kamala Harris, will have to answer the question as to whether or not this was evident earlier, and whether or not this was kept from Americans. I think that's something that Vice President Harris is going to have to be prepared to answer. But we'll see. If she ends up winning in November, I think that he will go down as a selfless statesman. If she ends up losing, I think his legacy will be far more mixed. I think that he has been, on foreign policy, a very, very impressive president. For instance, what he's done to bring together the NATO alliance when it's being threatened by Putin in Russia has been impressive. I think that his ability to bring Americans out of the chaos of the first Trump administration, take them through the most serious health crisis the country was facing in a generation, I think that's impressive as well. She'll have to answer for his policies on the southern border and for the inflation that's affecting Western democracies around the world. But those are questions she's going to have to answer for as well. But that record, although it might be impressive in many areas, will be neutered if she goes down to defeat in November.
You know, let's talk about the election and the campaign in a moment, but I do want to circle back to the fact that Joe Biden intends to finish out his term. And of course, his decision to step aside from the presidential race, that's already garnering a lot of attention from Republicans. One Republican congresswoman saying that if Biden is unfit to run for re-election, then he is unfit to serve the remainder of his term. You know, Ambassador Heyman, I'm wondering just how effective can the next 6 months be for Joe Biden when, you know, traditionally this is the lame duck period if this was his second term, but instead he's not going to run for re-election. He still wants to do things like pursuing a cure for cancer, reform of the U.S. Supreme Court. Are these just empty hopes at this moment in time?
Sometimes you can get a whole lot more done during as you describe it, a lame duck session. You can get a lot more done when you do not feel the pressures of having to be reelected. And so decisions could be made with a different lens. And you have to be realistic. If you're in the office and you're trying to run for reelection, you have an entirely different approach to life. And so now I think he can take the steps that he'd like to take for these remaining months. I'd like to see him get as many judges through the system as he possibly can. I'd like to see him work, as he said, on resolution in the conflict in the Middle East and Gaza in particular. I'd like to see him also work hard as he can to help elect Kamala Harris. And as Rob points out, I think some part of his legacy will be dependent upon whether or not she wins. And, that's up for debate. This is going to be a very close election. It's very tight. And there are a lot of people who are very excited, energized, writing checks, doing a lot of things for her right now. But there are a lot of people who are misogynists, who have unfortunate racist tendencies that will be energized on the other side. And this is going to be what looked like a race without a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm. I think now it's going to have an incredible amount of energy and enthusiasm, and it's going to probably have a very high turnout.
Mm-hmm. I hate to say it, but quickly running out of time, so I'm going to ask for a quick answer from both of you. Now that Joe Biden is essentially passing the torch on to Kamala Harris, can he actually help the campaign, or is he a drag on the campaign right now? Rob, I'll get you to start.
Well, I think if he finishes his presidency strongly, if he does come up with some foreign policy successes, if he keeps crises at bay, and the economy actually picks up steam in the latter half of this year, I think he can. I also think that he can help her campaigning in certain parts of the country that are very, very important. In Western Pennsylvania, he mentioned Scranton in his speech tonight. That's where he spent the first 11 years of his life. I can see him campaigning there with Senator John Fetterman, who's a strong supporter of him, and doing some real good for Vice President Harris. So there are areas of the country where he can help. But I think the best thing he can do for her campaign is cross the finish line with a high kick.
Bruce Heyman?
Gosh, it's hard to go against Rob. I think he's spot on here. I think the president has to deliver in his presidency. And as long as there are no new crises that develop or things that develop that we don't even anticipate. That being said, I will say the last month has brought more things than I ever thought would take place in a lifetime, and it happened in 30 days, and we still have 100 days or more to go. there's a whole lot that can happen in American politics here over the next few months, and we'll see how it plays out.
And again, quickly here, though, Ambassador Heyman, I'm wondering, now that Kamala Harris is there, are you a Democrat who believes that the next election is winnable for your party?
Not only is it winnable, it's existential in my view. I think Donald Trump is the greatest threat to democracy and the greatest threat to the Canada-U.S. relationship. And I'm going to work very hard to help her in primarily working on getting Americans living outside the United States to vote. All you've got to do is go to votefromabroad.org, register and vote. And Canadians can't do anything about the U.S. election, but Americans in Canada may actually be the swing factor in the U.S. election.
Ambassador Bruce Heyman, the last word to you. Thank you for that. Rob Russo, as always, thank you to you as well. Have a good evening. And to everyone who joined us this evening on CPAC, thank you. Have a good night.